Majesty's polygraph examiners during the final 4 years of the war in Vietnam. In his new memoir of Spies and Lies, Mr. Sullivan offers a perspective on the war from his tours of duty in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. This talk from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. is 40 minutes.
Well, about John Sullivan. He was born in New London, Connecticut, and raised on the eastern end of Long Island. After graduating from Albany State Teachers College, he then taught history at a high school in upstate New York. He entered the Army in 1962, and after a year at the Army Language School at Monterey, California, studying Russian, he was trained in military intelligence and sent to Germany. His tour in Germany was spent with the 513th Military Intelligence Group, and then he spent 9 months, where was that, where you were learning German? I'll let him say when he gets up here, yes. From 1967 until 1968, he attended graduate school at Michigan State University. And while at MSU, he applied for a position at the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was accepted. And from the June of 1968 until August of 1999, he was a polygraph examiner with the Central Intelligence Agency. During his career, he conducted more polygraph examinations than any examiner in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. And a little over 4 of his 31 years at the CIA were spent in Vietnam, and that is the basis of his book. So please, would you welcome John Sullivan?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for coming down here and getting a little respite from that terrible heat outside. I hope I can make you glad that you came here today. When I first got the idea of writing a book, the idea for writing a book came to me, quite frankly, off the cuff, out of nowhere. I was in a little bar, unfortunately, in a place called Bon Mi Tut, which is up in the highlands of central Vietnam. And I was regaling 2 agency case officers with tales of polygraph daring do. And there are some interesting cases that I did that, you know, make good conversation. When you're drinking a beer, it's nice to talk about. One of the guys said, "John, you really ought to write a book." And I said, "I think I will, and I'll call it Of Spies and Lies," as in Of Mice and Men. I thought that was kind of a cute title. That was the first thought I ever had about writing a book. The idea, prior to that time, the idea never entered my mind. And it was just something that I said, but the idea was planted in my mind that someday I would like to write a book. Now, when I joined the agency, I knew writing books isn't something that the agency looks upon with favor, and they discourage people from doing that. But over the years, I kept that thought in the back of my mind, and I said, at some point in time, I will write a book, and I'll call it Of Spies and Lies. Now, I retired in August of 1999. Sometime in 1998, I actually started thinking about, well, what do you want to write about? You know, do you want to just a bunch of anecdotes about polygraph? What do you want to do? I thought, well, that's what I'm going to do. I think I can write some anecdotes that will be entertaining, maybe a little bit enlightening, and I think that might sell a little bit too. I started writing the book, and I got in maybe the 3rd chapter when I started writing the chapter on Vietnam. And it occurred to me that one of the things I'm going to have to do with my book is give it to the agency's Publications Review Board for approval. And I thought, well, some of the stuff I'm writing about, they might not approve. Whereas if I just focus on Vietnam, most of that material has been declassified by now. It'll probably have a better chance of getting through the Publications Review Board. Also, the initial thought, this is just going to be too much of a book, too many different things, so why don't you just focus on one thing, do that well, and that might be a first step in writing a second book. Well, what considerations did I have when I decided I'm going to focus on Vietnam? All I'm going to write about is my time in Vietnam. The first thought I had was, what can I say about Vietnam that hasn't been said already? I don't want to repeat stuff that other people have written. Now, 4 of my colleagues who served with me in Vietnam had written books. Of course, I'm sure you're all aware of Frank Snepp's Decent Interval. I bought that the day it came out, and I read that, and I felt it to be a very informative book. John Cassidy wrote a book called Station in the Delta, which is a fictionalized account of his time down in MR4, which was the Delta. And there were some incidents there that were very heroic, very true. One friend of mine was very much involved in some of these incidents. I love that book. I couldn't write a book like that. I don't think I have the imagination for fiction, but that was a sample of what was being written. Another book that was written about Vietnam by a colleague was Slow Burn by Orrin DeForest. And frankly, I thought that was not a very accurate picture of what was going on in Vietnam. And again, it focused only on one area of Vietnam, a little Benoit MR3 in Vietnam. The final book that I read, in preparation, if you will, for this book, was Jim Parker's Last Man Out. Now that is a truly fine book about Vietnam, but there was more about Jim's military time in Vietnam than there was about his time with the CIA in Vietnam. And I felt at some point in time, an agency person should write a book about what it was really like to serve with the CIA in Vietnam. Not that it was necessarily very heroic, very spooky, whatever, very entertaining, but if anyone is going to learn anything about Vietnam, no one can adequately assess America's role in Vietnam without understanding the role of CIA in Vietnam. After Tet of 1968, as the American military influence in Vietnam drew down, the agency influence increased. And for the last 5 years in Vietnam, American policy, American activity in Vietnam was determined by decisions made by the CIA. I have seen no book to this date, maybe mine hopefully, but other than my book, I've seen no book that adequately presents what the CIA did in Vietnam in a way that is true to life and also interesting. All right, once I decide I'm going to write on Vietnam and I decide I've read these books, what can I say that is different? What qualifies me to write about Vietnam? Well, in the 4 years I was in Vietnam, I visited every province in Vietnam. I conducted more polygraph tests than any examiner that ever served there before or while I was there. I interacted with not only more case officers, but more people in general than any other CIA person serving in Vietnam. All right, I'm qualified. Write about what you know. I don't think there is anyone that knows more about how the CIA ran clandestine operations in Vietnam than I. I also had an opportunity to spend a lot of time in Cambodia. I saw firsthand what was going on over there. I got to Laos on 3 occasions. I think I had a very, very good picture of what the CIA is doing during the Vietnam War in that part of the world. Now, what other considerations did I have? Well, one of my primary considerations in writing the book was, in order to write an accurate book about what the CIA did in Vietnam, I'm going to have to trash some people. I'm going to have to say some bad things about people who served there with me. Now, contrary to the belief that polygraph examiners are sadists, I'm really not. And it bothered me very much that I may have to write some negative things about people with whom I served. Some of them I liked very, very much. In particular, General Charles Timmis. I love that man like an uncle. I mean, I thought he was just as wonderful a man, decent human being as I've ever met. But in my travels and my interactions with him, it occurred to me that he's an apologist for ARVN in the sense that the South Vietnamese military could do no wrong. Time and time again, they would do things, they would desert, they had a terrible desertion rate, and frankly, he'd cover these things up. And that information was not getting out. And I said, well, I'm going to have to write some bad things about General Timmis. And frankly, that bothered me very much. But if in the name of accuracy, I felt it was necessary to do. Also, some of the people I worked with were the ugliest Americans that God ever created. And they did more to hurt our cause in Vietnam than to help it. You would be surprised at how much I actually took out of the book, personal anecdotes about the concupiscences and the greed, etc., of some of the people with whom I work. But in the interest of not being just a gossip book, I felt I had to do that. So I took some of it out, but that was a very, very difficult thing for me to do. Write bad things about the people that I worked with. Another concern I had was, excuse me, please. Another concern I had is, what is the reaction of my colleagues going to be? In the Office of Security in particular, in which I was, for 31 years, I was assigned to the Office of Security, writing books or talking about anything about the agency is kind of verboten. And how would I be looked upon for having done that? And I finally realized that, I don't want to say it, but I really don't care. I think I have something to say about Vietnam that has not been said before. And if people are going to understand what went on over there, I'm going to have to tell people what they did. And I felt that I would be less than honest if I tried to cover up the roles of some of my colleagues over there. It bothered me. I frankly don't know whether I'll be getting any hate mail or not. I've had a couple of people say, well, I don't like you very much for having written that, but prove me wrong and maybe I'll change it next, with the next edition. But until you can show me that something I wrote was wrong, I'm sticking with my story. Now, once I made the decision to write about Vietnam, and I think it was, I retired on the 31st of August, 1999, and on September 1st, 1999, I sat down at the personal computer and began to write. And on 3 days, I know I spent 14 days at the PC, but I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And it was really quite a horrible mishmash by the time I got done. But by the time I had the first manuscript ready to go, I had someone look it over, and, you know, 2 people that I'd served with in Vietnam, I asked them to read the book, tell me what you found wrong with the book in terms of factually wrong. My interpretation of the facts may not be as accurate as some other people's or as good as some people's, but find a factual error in the book. Neither of these people could find a factual error in the book, and I felt very, very pleased about that. And the point I want to make is this. I never took one note in preparation for this book. Not one note did I take. I wrote absolutely off the top of my head. On occasion, I would certainly discuss with my wife, because she was there with me, whether this happened when I said it happened, etc. And I had access to a lot of people that served with me in Vietnam, and I would consult with them on occasion. But in terms of the factual material, they could not find one error, and that pleased me greatly. So I know I have, if you will, a truthful book. Another concern I had was, if any of you have read the book, you know there are an awful lot of names in the book. Do I use true names? Do I use aliases, or what? And what I found very interesting, I made the decision to use aliases in the book, and if I do it throughout, with few exceptions, some I think are commonly known, with few exceptions, I could use alias and felt that was the way to go. I couldn't believe how many people asked me to put them in true name. People were calling me and saying, oh, John, I'd really like you to put me in true name. I was retired. I retired as an open employee. I'm sure there'll be no problem. But just in case I felt if I do everybody or everyone in alias, then I don't have to worry about, you know, inadvertently putting someone out there that doesn't want to be out there. So I did all the aliases, and I, you know, edited as best I could. I was sure it was factually correct. And then I submitted it to the agency's Publications Review Board. One of the biggest surprises I've had in this entire process has been how accommodating the agency's Publications Review Board was. Dr. Steve Cook, he spells it K-O-C-H, but it's Cook, is the head of the Publications Review Board. I can't believe, one, how helpful he was, just how accommodating they were. Now, the initial manuscript was 106,000 words. Now, as my wife would probably tell you, that's a day's conversation for me. But out of 106,000 words, they asked me to take out a total of 9 words. Now, I know many people thought that if you write anything bad about the agency, they're not going to let that in. Absolutely not. And I know one of the people who reviewed my book and gave me, quite frankly, a very good review, said that agency's Publications Review Board checked the book to make sure nothing really incriminating got out. Well, they were very, very accommodating. I'm very, very grateful to the Publications Review Board. What's next? Well, after I sent the manuscript in, they came back and they said, okay, it's ready to go. If you just make these changes, we'll have no problem with it. So I sent out query letters regarding, would you be interested in publishing my book? And I was getting, I sent out a total of 9 query letters. I got 7 rejections, and then I got 2 offers of a contract. The rejection letters are very, very nice, but from what my friends tell me, people who have written, it's very unusual to have, to get an offer so quickly. Well, one of the offers I got, and I knew nothing, absolutely nothing about book, writer, publisher contracts, but on the face of it, I said, this first contract, this is not a good contract. I mean, the things they wanted me to do, I said, I don't think so, and it was with, believe me, heart and mouth that I turned this person down. Now, one of the query letters I had sent had been to the Smithsonian Institute Press, to the managing editor there, Mark Gatlin. Well, Mark wrote back and he said, John, we don't do this type of book, but I have a friend at University Press of Kansas who does this sort of book, and I think he might be interested. I wrote a letter to Mr. Briggs, Mike Briggs, and he sent back and said, yes, we're very interested. We just don't want a lot of stuff about the technical aspects of polygraph. I'm the least technical person that ever ran a polygraph test in the world, so that was no problem for me. And then I sent him the manuscript. The first thing they did was refer the manuscript to 2, in quotes, experts on Vietnam. And we'll have them read it, and if they like it, then we'll take the next step. Well, I sent the manuscript in to University Press of Kansas on the I know it was early October, and I didn't hear anything until the day before Thanksgiving, and I got a letter from Mr. Briggs saying, here are the first reviewer's comments. And although he had some editorial comments and ways things could be better, he did not find one factual error in the book, and if I would address the chronology, make it a little less confusing, he would recommend it for publication. Naturally, I was very elated, and I thought, well, that's okay. The suggestions he's made are helpful, and I'll do it. And I thought, well, the second review can't be too bad, and I was feeling very, very good. I just thank God I didn't get it before Christmas. I got the second reviewer's comments the day after Christmas, and quite frankly, he trashed me. I couldn't believe that someone could find that many mistakes or alleged mistakes in my book, and it was a real downer. I thought, oh my God, what is he doing to me? Well, quite frankly, I had not treated him very kindly in my book, so I thought it was a little bit of tit for tat. But I wrote Mike Briggs, and I said, I'm really disappointed in this. I think it's, I don't think a lot of his comments are valid, et cetera, and so forth. And Mike wrote back and said, well, would you be willing to make the corrections or the editing that he suggested? And I said yes. And what I found out was once I began following, if you will, his editorial suggestions, I became absolutely possessed with writing the book. And I also found out there's a lot of what he said that was very true. I may not have liked the way he delivered it, but I could not escape the fact that he picked a lot of things in the book that were weaknesses that needed adjusting. And I, once I began following it, I became possessed, and I know that the book was a better product because of the criticisms and the trashing he did of my book. I finished that in about, I think it was actually early April of 2001, and I thought, well, I'll send it in. In May, Mike wrote back and said, we are submitting the book to our board for approval. We think it's going to go. Congratulations, etc. In June, I got the contract, and I thought, well, gee, how long is it going to take for the book to get out? Well, from the time you submit a book till the time they get it out can go anywhere up to 2 years, but it's almost a year to the day since I submitted it that they actually put the book out for publication. Now, in looking at the book and looking at the comments and the reviews that I've gotten so far, I think one of the fairest things that's been said about the book is that my prose style is not powerful. It's workmanlike. I'd also like to state that Of Spies and Lies is not a scholarly book. I'm not a scholar. I don't write as a scholar of books. I don't write as a scholar. Frank Snep's Decent Interval was a scholarly book. It was written, I think, for a different audience than mine. I want the average person who went to Vietnam to be able to sit down and read the book, identify with me, identify with the situations that I was experiencing in Vietnam, not necessarily to sympathize with me, but to understand how frustrating it was. Now, as I said, the book is not a scholarly book, but there are lessons to be learned from being in Vietnam. There are lessons to be learned from how we performed in Vietnam. I frankly think that some of those lessons have been learned. Well, what lessons have been learned? I know that back in the late 70s and early 80s, I know there was a move afoot to go into Zaire and the Congo to get involved in that particular venture that we were involved in at that time. And I know the statement was made by someone in a high place, didn't we learn anything from Vietnam? Let's not do this. Same thing with the Iran-Contra. There were lessons that were learned over there. Some are still being learned. And I think we have learned a little bit, but not enough. But regardless of how much we learned by our experience in Vietnam, the price wasn't worth it. I thought, writing this book is part mea culpa. I'll never escape the feeling of guilt for, I went to Vietnam, not necessarily a hawk. When I was at when I got to Michigan State, I was a hawk. 5 years in the military. I went to Michigan State where the radical movement, the anti-war movement was in full bloom. And, I was saying to myself, who are these armpits with eyes criticizing the values, calling our GIs baby killers? Those kids that we sent to Vietnam were every bit as scared as, they were just terrified, fighting for survival, and I admired them greatly for what they did, and I hated these people for criticizing these kids. And yet, as more and more Vietnam War veterans began participating in these protests, as it were, I'm going to say maybe it's something we ought to listen to. I remember waking up in late January of 1968, and I remember listening to Walter Cronkite as Tet of 68 started, and Walter Cronkite saying, hey, I thought we were winning the war. Well, most people did think we were winning it, but we weren't. Okay, so I really want you to understand just how difficult our role was, and we did, in many ways, the best we could. Unfortunately, we didn't always send our best and brightest to do the best, and that was a problem. But that's one thing I would like people to get out of this, that we played a role there. It was a very, very difficult role. It was very, very frustrating. Another thing that I want you to understand from reading the book was that losing the Vietnam War was a cooperative effort. Everybody played its role. The military, by not reporting negative statistics, certainly played a role. The agency also got into this mode of not really telling it like it was. I remember one incident in particular, and it's in the book. I attended a briefing. This was in February of 1975, 2 months before the war came to an end. And the person who was giving the briefing was Frank Snep. And he was saying how everything was going very well. We see no real problems. And one of the people attending the briefing stood up and said, that may be what's going on, in the rest of Vietnam, but sure as hell isn't what's going on down here in the Delta. We've lost over half the provinces since the 1st of January. And Snep's answer was, guys, I'm just quoting the party line. So the CIA had a party line too, and one of the people attending the briefing actually alluded to the fact that he said, when Tom Polgar, who was the chief of station, he met with Kissinger and Nixon at San Clemente 3 months ago when the word was out, Vietnamization is working, and there's nothing going out of Vietnam that says otherwise. So we all, in the State Department, certainly went along with that. So we all had a role to play in the loss of the war in Vietnam. Another thing I would like you to come away with from reading of Spies and Lies is that wars are not supposed to be fun. And for too many Americans in Vietnam, myself included, the war was fun. Not long ago, someone commenting on the war in Vietnam said, if the women had been less pretty, the war would have lasted about 6 months. And unfortunately, there is a bit of truth in that statement. Vietnam, for many people, was an escape from reality. And we did not serve the Vietnamese well by being there. Tom Polgar, who was the last chief of station in Saigon, I think he said it best: we did not serve these people well. Now, Mr. Polgar and I came to our epiphanies by different routes, but the saddest part of my leaving Vietnam is the fact that we did not serve those people well. Now, I know there was a congressman from Connecticut who, speaking before Congress in January of 1975, commented that what we have in Vietnam is a moral commitment, not a legal commitment. Therefore, we don't have to adhere to the Paris Peace Accords. Well, that means we're morally bankrupt. If our President and Secretary of State can't make a commitment that subsequent presidents will follow, that means our foreign policy is weak, and in particular to Vietnam. It was a betrayal of the Vietnamese, and I believe that. So I left with, I will be forever haunted by the fact that, we didn't do anything anything positive for the Vietnamese people, and I don't think I'll ever escape that sense of guilt. And I also, last but not least, what I want as a polygraph examiner for 31 years, no one is more aware than I of the controversy that surrounds polygraph. I am not one of these people that thinks it's the panacea that's going to cure all our security ills, or I don't think, well, let me put it this way. It's not as good as many of its proponents say it is, and it's not as bad as many of our detractors say it is. I think done properly, it can be very, very useful, and I'm an adherent of it. I see the potential for misuse, but I think in the current situation here, I think it can be very, very useful. There's a lot of other things I'd like to say, but in my other experiences in talks like this, there have always been a lot of questions, so I would like to open the floor to questions. And please, I will not avoid questions. I'll answer as directly as I possibly can. Please.
I grew up in Connecticut. I'm curious who the congressman was.
See me afterwards, and I'll tell you that. Okay.
Are we having a problem with the sound?
Yes, Mr. Sullivan, did the CIA successfully recruit assets in the Viet Cong apparatus that existed in the South that was creating such a havoc and a problem?
I don't believe that we ever recruited I don't believe we ever had a really successful penetration of the VC. Anyone above certainly the village level. Now, prior to '68, we did have a couple that I'm very well aware of that were dissatisfied with the VC, came to us. They would tell us where there was going to be a meeting, and in one particular case, I know we had an airstrike, killed over 200 VC, and unfortunately one of the ones that was killed was this guy that came to us, said he hated the VC and they did this and that, and so he reported to us. But in terms of penetrations, no. Now, the #1 agent in Vietnam, I call Fireball in my book. He was, according to the latest information I have, and this comes from the North Vietnamese themselves, we did recruit an agent, but he told us he wasn't a VC. Absolutely denied. He said he was getting the information from someone else. I'm not exactly sure why he did that. I think he thought if he really told us he was a VC, we'd never believe him because we'd had so many that just never were. But it turned out this guy actually was a VC. But at the time of the evacuation, we offered to get him out and he refused. That gave me the idea, well, maybe he wasn't really, maybe he was actually working for the VC, And they were using him as a conduit to get information that they wanted us to have, for whatever, as convoluted as that may seem. As it turns out, the guy was a VC. He was working for us, the military, several other organizations. He was a real paper mill. He gave us absolutely great information. But they arrested his case officer the day that Vietnam fell. And he blew the whistle on this guy, and the agent Fireball committed suicide before he could be arrested. That is the only, if you will, penetration that we had of the VC infrastructure that I actually know was a VC, but at the time, we did not know he was actually a VC.
Excuse me, can you tell me how accurate the polygraph is?
Okay, this is what makes it art and not science. On a particular situation, recently I was called by Channel 7 and asked if I thought they should test the people out at Fort Detrick regarding this anthrax. And I said, that's what the polygraph was made for. One issue, did you take it, or are you in any way involved in the removal of that anthrax from the facility? I said, there are two problems here. One, the person who took it may not work there anymore. You don't know whether that person is still there. I absolutely believe if the person who took it were to be polygraphed, it would show up on the polygraph. The problem we have with polygraph today, and particularly in the intelligence, we dilute, the more questions we ask, the less reliable it is. Now, for example, if one of you right here now had your wallet stolen, just say you're sitting here and all of a sudden you realize your wallet was stolen. If it's a given that someone in this room had to have taken it, I feel quite confident I could find out who took it. I do. But the more questions you ask, the less reliable it is. There are so many extraneous factors that impact on the reliability of polygraph. The reaction between the examiner and the subject can have a significant effect on polygraph. I always tell junior examiners or people who came in after I did that the person who tests you does not have to like you, but they cannot dislike you. And if they do, you will never get an admission from them. The most valid polygraph test is one in which you see a reaction to a question, you advise the person that he's reacted to the question, and you get an explanation for that reaction that can be verified polygraphically. Less than that, it's what we call a swag. That's a scientific wild-ass guess because you really don't know. That's the best I can say. I have done tests where I felt, in this particular case, it was 90% accurate. But until you get that admission, you really don't know. But I do think for every circumstance, I think the reliability changes. That's as good an answer as I can give you. Please.
Could you add something on the linguistic dimension of conducting polygraph exams in another language?
Oh, absolutely. With a good interpreter, I think it works. Now, there is nothing better than being able to communicate one-on-one. I've had examples where, the person I'm testing will not speak to another. For example, if the interpreter's from his country, he said, you'll be gone next year. This guy's going to be here forever. And if the politics change, he's going to know that I worked with you guys. So that is a problem. I found that with a good interpreter, it's not as reliable as I would like, but with a good interpreter, I think it is effective. But I have caught interpreters, I don't want to say sandbagging me, but changing my meanings of questions. And they do it, they think, well, I'm just helping, I'm saving you from yourself. But I'd rather not use an interpreter, but if I can, if I can do it one-on-one, I've conducted tests in Spanish and German by myself, and I've used interpreters for a lot of different languages. I'd prefer not to use interpreters, but if the interpreter is good, and you have to prepare the interpreter when you do a test, you don't just write out some questions and say, these are the questions. What you do is you write out the questions in English, and you give them to the interpreter and say, I want you to write those out in your foreign language, then give me my list back. And now you're going to read the questions to me to make sure that the wording is correct. I don't let them look at my typewritten questions. You read them back to me, and I'll make sure that the questions are worded as I want them. It's a handicap, but one that can be overcome, if that answers your question, sir. Please.
Going once. All right, let me get over here.
I don't fully understand your reasoning, Mr. Sullivan, for using aliases in the book.
Well, many of our people, agency people, retired undercover. They have never acknowledged and cannot acknowledge that they were agency. So if you've retired undercover, I can't put your true name in the book. I mean, there's some people in particular that are in jobs right now, some teaching in colleges, that don't want it known that they worked for the CIA. So that's the rationale for that, sir.
John, is that what's known as methods and sources?
No, absolutely not. No, Sam. That is, the fact is that many of our people are undercover. They're not openly known as agency employees, and I'm certainly not going to expose them if they don't want me to. You know, if they've retired undercover, I am perfectly willing to let them stay that way, sir.
In these polygraph tests that you administered, who were the people, for the most part, that you were giving these tests to? I mean, were they Vietnamese? Were they?
90% of them, yes, they were Vietnamese, ma'am. They were agents that our people had supposedly recruited. Now, for example, most of the agents that we had in Vietnam were recruited by members of the South Vietnamese Special Branch. I mean, our people couldn't go out into the countryside and meet one-on-one with people. I mean, there's no way that could be done. They stuck out, as I said in my book, like Wilt Chamberlain in a room full of midgets. So the Special Branch would come to us and they'd say, I have a guy that's a security cadre in the VC. Well, we have to polygraph them. In my first 6 months in Vietnam, I found, well, at least 5 that were not VC. They were complete fabricators, etc. But 90% of the people, I tested North Vietnamese prisoners of war. I tested local Vietnamese who were employed by us as interpreters, as barbers, whatever. And I tested other foreign nationals that came to us. For example, we had a foreigner come to us one day in Saigon and claimed that he was aware of a mission to blow up the embassy. They were going to attack the French embassy, which was right next to ours, go through the French embassy, come into our embassy and blow it up. Well, he turned out to be a fabricator. But the point is, most of the people I tested were Vietnamese. Agents, support agents, that sort, man. Please.
Actually, okay, let's get to the last question here.
I'd like to take off on your comment about whether war should be fun and how this relates to how guys are built and what makes guys run and fight. I know a guy who actually I think still works for the National Archives of an Irish name, who's very Irish heritage, who served a year in Vietnam. And he said he's all for peace, but he knows himself well enough to know that what the time he most felt alive was when he was in Vietnam, so he'd feel it'd be hypocritical to come out as a peacenik. And I was so wondering how much your experience correlates with religious and ethnic heritage, the religious training, and Irish whatever. Just like the FBI is a great place for Irish boys to, and particularly this relates to McCarthyism, what was really behind McCarthyism. And one thing is said is a war between the ethnic Catholics and the WASP Protestants like Dean Acheson, whose father was Connecticut Bishop of Episcopal. And how do you feel that this tract, and is this a no-no subject to talk about, even with aliases?
Well, it's kind of a tough question. It's a little bit... Excuse me? Oh, I'm sorry. It's a little bit complex, but I would say this, that there were good people in Vietnam, and there were a lot of young kids, a lot of people who had never been exposed to that type of an environment before. I am very, very fortunate that I had my wife with me in Vietnam. That made all the difference in the world. But I would suggest that, you know, good guys are good guys. Boys will be boys, and Vietnam was a sexual cornucopia for people who'd never been exposed to that environment before. And the VD rate was horrible over there among our people. But I can't, you know, beyond that, I I really don't know what to say. I don't think the way guys are built had very much to do with the situation that I saw in Vietnam. One of my colleagues in the agency, I was having dinner at his house one night, and he was asking me about the war, and I made the not off the wall comment, I just made an aside. I said the only thing we did in Vietnam was make it a bigger whorehouse. And that's not a very nice thing to say, but that's what I saw when I was there. I mean, what we did to the Vietnamese society, Vietnamese society wasn't ready for 500,000 American GIs. They weren't ready for the consumer economy. They weren't ready. The Vietnamese have a very, very strong family structure. And all of a sudden you have their sons who are shoeshine boys and their daughters who are bar girls making more money than the father. That ruined or really disrupted the family structure in Vietnam. And I felt guilty about that. I don't think I was an active participant in that, but I felt guilty about it. But the idea that because guys are made a certain way, I can't really address that, ma'am.
John,
yes.
I have a question.
Please.
This book's come out. What do you have next? What's coming up next for you?
What I'm trying to do is put together a book about, my title right now is In Search of Truth, the CIA and Polygraph. As a CIA lie detector polygraph examiner, I guess I am someone who is in or has been in constant search of truth. I think there's a lot to say about the role of polygraph in the CIA. I think it's going to be a much more broader concept book than this one is. It'll address the whole world aspect of how it's worked around the world. That's where I am right now. I'm working on it. I think I'm going to have a little more difficulty getting this one through the Publications Review Board than the last one. But I hope it'll entertain as well as enlighten, just as I hope my book of Spies and Lies will do. I hope you're entertained by it. I hope you're enlightened by it. And that's about all I can say. But thank you all so very much. Thank you very much.
John Sullivan was a recruiter, team leader, and polygraph examiner for the CIA from 1968 to 1999. His memoir, Of Spies and Lies, is part of the Modern War Studies series at the University Press of Kansas. Visit kansaspress.ku.edu.